Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I thank Jeff and Michael and Jill so much for the invitation to be here, and to Lila and to Damien for involving me in their wonderful project. Now, I'm here to talk a little bit to you about Boston's Apollo. This is an exhibition that inspired the opera that I organized at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston in 2020. So the exhibition actually opened on the 13th of February, and originally intended for 3 months. It was prolonged because of the pandemic. As you know, I'm sure you're all familiar with, lots of things happened in 2020 that we couldn't predict, and it actually ended up being closed a lot of that time. But I'm so thrilled and delighted that the story of Thomas McKeller and John Singer Sargent made it out there despite all of those challenges. For me, the exhibition began in 2017, really by chance. I had gone down to our storage room to look for a group of etchings by the artist James McNeill Whistler, some etchings of Venice. And instead of finding those, I came across another group of artworks in a large format portfolio. They were a group of 10 works on paper, 9 charcoal sketches, and 1 lithograph that you see in the bottom right-hand corner there. And so I'm showing you that group of works here on the screen. They were part of the permanent collection of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, so owned originally by our founder, Isabella Stewart Gardner herself. But the peculiar thing was that I had never seen them before, and that's very odd because about 99% of our collection is on display and otherwise known to all of our staff. There were several things that struck me about these drawings immediately. The first one was just how brilliant they were artistically. The figure on each one of these pieces of paper just leapt off of the page. The second thing that was immediately noticeable was that they were by John Singer Sargent, and you could tell that not just because of the style, but because he in fact signed every single one of them in the bottom right-hand corner. And that immediately piqued my interest because Sargent did not sign all of his works of art. And then finally, the fact that the man depicted in them was the same man, it seemed, in each one, and that he was black. And that was a huge surprise for 2 reasons. One, because I didn't know of any works by John Singer Sargent, portraits, for example, of black men. And 2, because looking at the compositions of these drawings, it became immediately clear that they were studies or preparatory studies for a large project of ceiling murals that he did in Boston between 1917 and 1921. The ceiling murals were painted on the ceiling of the entrance of the Museum of Fine Arts, so the next door neighbor to the Gardner Museum. And I'm very familiar with those because they're 100 yards away from where I work. But I also know that the ceiling is filled with figures of Greek and Roman gods and goddesses, and all of them are white. And so this really caught my attention. What it meant was that the model for at least these figures in the murals was black, but that Sargent had, through the artistic process, transformed him into these classicizing white figures. And it meant that there was a story here and that I wanted to find out more. So we'll fast forward for a second, 3 years later, the opening of the exhibition, and this is quite a lot of research later too. And thank goodness it was before the pandemic, because I don't think we would have had access to the same kinds of sources we did. What we discovered was not only was this man whose name was Thomas McKeller, that was one of the things we figured out, Thomas Eugene McKeller, the model for the Museum of Fine Arts ceiling murals, the principal model, if not the only model. He was also the model for another cycle of murals that Sargent completed in Boston at Harvard University's principal campus library, the Harvard's Widener Library. And that's actually what you see. So you see the rotunda of the MFA here in the exhibition on the far left. Then you see the next picture to the right is one of the 2 murals from Harvard's library. He actually also posed the robes for the president of Harvard University's portrait Abbot Lawrence Lowell. So you see that portrait of Lowell sitting there in his graduation robes. He came in, had his face painted by Sargent, and then McKeller took over, wore the robes, and Sargent painted the rest of the body using McKeller's figure. And then finally, he also modeled for a fourth commission for another artist, Cyrus Dallin, who is a sculptor. And Thomas McKeller modeled for the figure of Massasoit, the Wampanoag sachem who, according to legend, had welcomed the pilgrims when they arrived in Plymouth. This was fairly, I mean, all of this information was new. It was certainly news to me, and there was very little of it, the threads which had ever been drawn together before. And so what effectively this meant was we had stumbled across the unsung hero of Boston's public art. And nobody knew it because none of the figures in the paintings and the sculptures that were made looked anything like him. None of them were this black man. None of them were his face. And so we decided that this is the story that we were committed to telling, that we were going to figure out who he was, so write his biography for the first time, and we were going to try to tell the story of these major public artistic commissions through his perspective as much as possible, and to find out more about his relationship with Sargent, his professional relationship, and perhaps more. And these questions and the research raised more questions of race, of gender, and of sexuality that seemed just as relevant in our present day as we were doing this research as they did in Gilded Age Boston. Now, I have to say that the process of digging up the life of Thomas McKeller was extremely difficult. Scarce records survived. As we continued through our research, we made major use of public records, things like census records. Many of them were wrong or contradictory. It took us almost a year and a half to figure out his correct birth date. He was born in 1890 in Wilmington, North Carolina. And also, it was a lot of the gaps in his life. There were a number of gaps in his life that we couldn't quite put our finger on, what the trajectory of that moment looked like. And one of those questions was about his departure from Wilmington, North Carolina, and his arrival in Boston. And while we couldn't find absolutely certain evidence, we believe that there's a good chance that it involved the Wilmington Massacre. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, the Wilmington Massacre was an event in 1898 where, threatened by black political and economic success in the city of Wilmington, white supremacists stormed through the city over the course of several days, burned down the headquarters of a black newspaper, that's what you're looking at in this photograph, and killed many of the black citizens. So their estimates are anywhere between in the 60s and in the several hundreds of individuals. Those who were not killed fled the city, some of whom would return, but many of whom would not, because after a cataclysmic event of racial violence like this, there were really very few opportunities for black citizens in Wilmington anymore. Thomas McKeller only would have been 8 years old at this time, but this event could not but have affected his life. And I would have to imagine as a historian that this was a major influence, a major deciding factor in leaving and choosing to look for professional opportunities elsewhere. We know that he came to Boston. We don't know exactly when, but he was certainly part of a larger wave of migration from southern cities, of young black men and women from southern cities to northern cities. Boston was one in particular where it was where there were more opportunities, particularly opportunities like in the service industries, in hotels, and particularly on the railroad. Boston was a hub of the Pullman train car operation, and many of the porters on the Pullman trains were black, and there was a union, in fact, as well. And so these were considered to be well-paying, secure jobs, and Boston was considered to be less dangerous. And of course, while Boston was not legally segregated, there was still segregation by custom, by neighborhood, and by practice. So while it wasn't Wilmington, I don't mean to paint it as a utopia. What we do know is that Thomas McKeller arrived in the city. It's possible that he worked first informally as a contortionist. There's some information to suggest that, which is very interesting that he then came to work as a model because it suggests that he was comfortable in holding difficult poses, and then eventually got a more secure job as a bellhop at the Hotel Vendome. The Vendome was Boston's leading luxury hotel, and it was also the residence of choice when John Singer Sargent came to town. In 1916, John Singer Sargent arrived back in Boston after a 13-year hiatus, and he returned in order to complete the ceiling murals, a third cycle of ceiling murals, of the Boston Public Library. This had been a long and drawn-out commission. One day in the fall of 1916, according to secondhand sources, he got into the elevator at the Hotel Vendome and met the young Thomas McKeller. And it was in that moment that he first saw him, that they first spoke, and that he asked if Thomas McKeller would agree to pose for him in his studio. So it was an incredibly powerful moment in the history, what was about to become these major public works of art in the city. As I mentioned, there are so many things, if things like even his birthday were hard to track down, trying to fill in the gaps of more contextual information, like what were their conversations like, you can imagine was near on impossible. So we had to look beyond our sort of traditional sources to contextualize what Black Boston was like at the time. And this was, and I should say this now, that in this project we really looked to include as many voices as possible in telling this story. And so this was one way of both investing the project with as much richness as we possibly could in all of the different narratives, and also in recognizing that those of us who were perhaps within the museum did not have the life experience that would allow us to do full justice to those stories. One of the people who was of enormous help to our project was Lorraine O'Grady. Some of you who are contemporary art fans are probably familiar with her. Lorraine is a legendary conceptual artist. She has been all her life. You may have seen her retrospective of her work at the Brooklyn Museum. It was about a year and a half ago, and she is still going very strong. Lorraine became an incredible interlocutor for this project, in part because her family had migrated from Jamaica to Boston to seek better opportunities in the very moment when Thomas McKeller was moving to Boston. And she wrote to me to caution me against jumping to conclusions about Thomas McKellar's level of education and interests based on the fairly menial service job that he had been able to acquire at that time. And I wrote it down here to quote from one of the emails that she wrote to me. She said, "The details you mention of Thomas McKeller, the jobs, places lived, etc., all ring such a nostalgic bell. He sounds like a solid middle-class black man of the period. In general, you have to remember it's impossible to judge black people by the jobs they held at that time, especially during the Jim Crow era, a time of no job options at all, particularly in Boston. My father worked on the Boston and Albany Railroad, first as a waiter, then as a steward, and finally as a bartender. He ran gambling games on the side. The founders, as members of the Pullman Porters Union, were all men like these, with dreams and educations, but having to do the best that they could." And so that was really, she wanted me to think bigger about how we had to understand people in that context in that time. And it was really crucial to helping flesh out our picture of Thomas McKeller at this moment when we didn't necessarily have all of those conversations and biographical details that we wanted. Now, some of the sources which allowed us to fill in the you could say, the skeleton of information were archival sources like the census that I mentioned, like his World War I and World War II draft cards. McKeller was a veteran. He served with he trained with a black infantry unit in preparation for World War I. Payments to him by John Singer Sargent. So I'm showing you at the bottom left-hand corner a check for $20. And then his address. And so you could trace where he had been, where he had lived across the city. And interestingly, so when he arrived in Boston, he lived in a series of boarding houses. And because the census records were by address, you could see who else had lived in the boarding houses with him. And so, for instance, he lived in a boarding house with a number of other young black men who also worked at the Hotel Vendôme. You could see potentially who some of his friends might have been. One of the incredible sources that we eventually discovered were the words of Thomas McKeller himself. And I have to say, when we started the project, we really weren't going to get our hopes up that we would ever have first-person accounts by Thomas McKeller himself. Because while it's very easy to track down letters by John Singer Sargent in archives all over the United States, trying to find letters by Thomas McKeller is another project entirely. We had been in touch with descendants of John Singer Sargent, and I had asked them if as they were going through and reviewing their family archive, could they please keep an eye out for letters from Thomas McKeller to the painter. And while they didn't find any from McKeller to the painter, they had a number of letters addressed to Sargent's biographer. So there was a man named David Mckibben, who began writing a biography shortly after Sargent died in 1925. And the first thing that he did was try to hunt down in Boston everybody who had known John Singer Sargent and interview them before they died. And it turned out that one of the people he had tracked down was Thomas McKeller. And there was a whole sheaf of letters in which Thomas McKeller described his work with John Singer Sargent in his own words. And that was a really revelatory moment for us. So I took one passage from one of the letters here. He said, "Dear Sir, I received your letter seeking some information regarding my affiliation with John Singer Sargent's work. I believe that I became his main model while he was here in this country." And indeed, he did. And that was one of the catalysts that pushed us to look for other projects he had worked on with John Singer Sargent, so not just the Museum of Fine Arts murals, but then we discovered the Harvard Widener Library murals, the portrait of Lowell, and eventually the figure of Dallin as well. I want to walk through a couple of those projects just very quickly so that you get a little bit of a context of this moment. The Museum of Fine Arts hired John Singer Sargent in 1917, and Sargent actually didn't start working on this project until that initial meeting with McKeller. And that told us something really important, that it wasn't just any model who had kind of helped Sargent begin the creative process on this project, but it was Thomas McKeller in particular. The two really hit it off and shared what must have been a very good rapport, because as any artist will tell you, it's not just any model that will do if you're working on a creative process. You really have to find a bond or a connection. And the fact that Sargent and McKeller then worked together for the next 4 years suggests that this was quite a strong bond, that they really both found something in this relationship. Now, Sargent was hired to do the Rotunda, which was in the entrance of the Museum of Fine Arts, and the museum wanted it to be more appropriate to an art setting, so he painted figures of, he designed and planned figures of gods and goddesses from antiquity, and allegories of the arts, so like the Muses, for example, and the god Apollo. Now we have to imagine this is a project that, it began in 1917, wasn't completed until 1921. Of course, there was the interruption, significant one-year interruption of World War I, during which Sargent went back to Europe, served as a war artist. McKeller was drafted and trained with a black infantry unit, and then the two came back together afterwards. But during the course of this project, there must have been a huge number of sittings together in John Singer Sargent's studios. And we were able to find just one letter that related to this kind of appointment. And I'll read you. It's a very perfunctory kind of letter, which I'm showing here on the left side of the screen. It's from Sargent to McKeller, and he says, "Dear Mr. McKeller, I think you said you were free on Saturday afternoon. If so, please come to the Pope Building at 2:30, and then please come to the Riverway studio at 132 Riverway on Sunday morning at 10:15. Now, I'm showing you here the Pope Building studio in the center of the screen. It was a soaring building with incredible light coming in the top floors, and Sargent had the top 2 floors of the building. It's still there today. Of course, now it's luxury condominium, so doesn't look much like Sargent's studio anymore. And then on the right was the other studio, William James's studio, the one he borrowed on the Riverway. Now, William James was not the writer Henry James's brother, but it was Henry James's nephew, so William James's son, and he too was a painter, and he was one of the individuals who was friends with Sargent and looked after his legacy when he died. Now, one of the things that this letter made us realize was that there were probably other letters that just didn't survive making these appointments over many, many days of return appointments, but also that many of them were made in person, and so there wouldn't have been any physical record of those kinds of appointments. The drawings, the sheer number of preparatory drawings themselves, however, indicated that this was a long and sustained effort, with Thomas McKeller modeling for almost all of the figures in the ceiling, even many of the figures of women. You see here the final completed ceiling as it was when it opened in October 1921. You can see that there were both sculpted elements as well as painted elements. The roundel at the bottom with the blue background, for instance, shows the god Apollo surrounded by the muses. There were allegories of architecture and of painting, and these were the kinds of subjects that were felt to be appropriate to a museum entrance at that time. In order to design a work of art in this very unique space, this large rotunda, Sargent enlisted the help of an architect, and that architect, Thomas Fox, made a scale replica of the space so that Sargent could actually make little mock-ups of each of the paintings and each of the sculptures, put them in the space, and understand how they would work. And he gave one of the little elements of that mock-up, that urn, you can see, to Isabella Stewart Gardner. Isabella Stewart Gardner was a first-hand witness to this process over many years. She had her museum next door to the Museum of Fine Arts, and she and John Singer Sargent had been the best of friends and continued to be. They were dinner companions, they went to the theater together, and she was definitely one of the people who was kind of had a front seat to the creative process. People sometimes ask about what the mechanics might have looked like of transforming this man, this black man, who was a model for almost all of these classical figures who were clearly white figures, how that could have worked. And I think this is the single best illustration of how that process might have worked in practice. So you'll see in the top right-hand corner of the sheet in the middle of the screen is a sketch, a very pale sketch, not completely filled in, of Thomas McKellar's face and his right shoulder, just the edge of his right shoulder. Now, when Sargent finished that, he moved below and he copied the head of an ancient Roman statue of Apollo, a cast that the Museum of Fine Arts owned in their collection, so he had immediate access to it. And then in the final study, the study for the actual figure of Apollo in his murals, he took the head of the classical statue and he planted it on Thomas McKellar's shoulders. So he literally replaced his head with the head of a classical statue and kept the body which he had posed in these multiple different positions. This is very much the process that Thomas McKellar himself described in one of his letters to David Mckibben. When John Singer Sargent had completed the rotunda, the museum was so thrilled that they invited him to extend it out over the stairwell. Sargent was, of course, thrilled to continue the project, which was a great public work of art. And this was a moment at which he's really thinking about his legacy. And you know that his portraits were mostly in private collections, but it was public murals like this which the public would be able to see after he died and think of him. Thomas McKellar says his next big task was the decoration of the staircase at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Atlas with the world on his shoulders, this was my body except my head. So that's exactly the kind of process we saw playing out in the drawing that I just showed you. And frankly, we never would have known that the model for this painting was Thomas McKellar, if not for his own testimony in his own words. And it was really thanks to these letters that we were able to understand more of the figures who he had posed for. Hot on the heels of his success at the Museum of Fine Arts, Harvard University hired John Singer Sargent to paint a commemorative World War I mural in their principal campus library, the Widener Library. And so you see here the finished product, which is two large-scale arched murals on either side of the staircase. The subjects of these murals were the victorious American soldiers returning home. And once again, John Singer Sargent turned to Thomas McKellar. McKellar, in fact, we know from his letters, went to the army base where he had trained and asked to borrow uniforms of the soldiers so that he could bring them back to Sargent's studio, and he and another model could pose as the figures of the soldiers that John Singer Sargent would then study in his charcoal drawings and then paint into his mural. The individual who hired John Singer Sargent for this project was President Lowell. He was then president of Harvard University, and his friends at Harvard then asked John Singer Sargent to paint Lowell's portrait as kind of a tribute to the president at the time. You saw the portrait in the second slide that I showed, the man in his graduation robes and his red collar. Thomas McKeller wore those robes so that Lowell only had to sit for a short time so that Sargent captured his face, and then he would paint the rest of his body from Thomas McKellar's body. The really brutal irony of this was that Lowell was probably the most bigoted president in the history of Harvard University. He was notorious, is today notorious, for having expelled all of the black students from the freshman dormitories, for having instituted a quota for Jewish students, and having effectively created a tribunal that would not only root out homosexual students on campus, but would effectively make it impossible for them to ever hold a job were a reference to be asked of them from Harvard University. So it's the fact that Thomas McKeller and Lowell probably never met, we don't know, but it's a real sort of shock of history that the two of them came together in this way. One of the questions that had come up many times was could John Singer Sargent and Thomas McKeller have had more than a professional relationship? Could they have also had a personal relationship? And one of the things that made people ask this question was this incredible painting that Sargent did of McKeller. It's Sargent's only monumental male nude. And it started as a study for the ceiling of the Museum of Fine Arts. You can see the circle inscribed behind his figure in blue. We know that was for one of the roundels in the ceiling, as probably the figure of Prometheus. Sargent abandoned that idea completely and proceeded with it as an independent portrait, not a commissioned portrait. McKeller didn't ask him to do it, but Sargent seems to have done it for his own pleasure, and really for himself, because we know that after it was complete, he hung it in his studio right up until he died in 1925. Several individuals saw it there. And because of the nudity of the portrait, the frank sensuality, and the fact that we know that Sargent was gay, we don't know much about Thomas McKellar's sexuality, it raised the question about whether the two of them could have had a more intimate relationship, possibly. We don't have evidence. There's no hard evidence about this either way, but we wanted audiences in the exhibition to be able to think about that too. One of the few insights into Thomas McKellar's personal life we had actually came from a member of his family who we managed to track down, one of the only surviving members of his family. And she said that when she was a little girl, this was Deirdre McKeller O'Brien, she remembers that her family talked about her great-uncle Thomas in a certain way that at the time didn't really make any sense to her as a little girl, but that as an adult, she wondered if it could have been because he was gay, and that being gay in their family was taboo, and that this was one this is a reason why they used a particular way of talking about him. We interviewed her for a very short documentary film that we did on the exhibition, and so I'd encourage you to seek that out. It's online if you'd interested in more information. I'll run through this very quickly. The portrait by McKeller may have inspired another painter, Buford Delaney, who painted a portrait of James Baldwin several years later. And even though the compositions are not identical, the sort of frontal seated poses of both men sort of made us wonder whether one could have inspired the other. And we realized right before we opened the exhibition that Delaney had actually visited Sargent's studio right before Sargent died in 1925, which was where this portrait was located. And so it's still, it's a very pregnant possibility, and it's one that kind of we wanted to raise to our visitors as well. The final character in this story was Isabella Stewart Gardner, and I'll just say briefly that she must have met Thomas McKeller many times. There was in fact one occasion in which he carried her up the stairs of the Pope building, as well as some records that she had brought with her. By 1919 she had had a stroke and she was completely incapacitated, so that would have been why. And Thomas certainly being in the studio, Isabella being a close and intimate friend of John Singer Sargent, meant that the three of them must have had conversations there together, and if only we could have been a fly on the wall for those conversations. This was our group, and in the film, Deirdre McKeller O'Brien at the front, our visiting curator of performing arts, Helga Davis, who directed the short documentary I mentioned, and Claire MacDonald, who is the daughter-in-law of Thomas's best friend and who met him during his life and who shared some personal recollections. So again, this was in trying to gather many voices for this project. And finally, Lorraine O'Grady contributed, the very end of the project, a new work of art, A Strange Taxi Stretched, which really spoke to her because this exhibition spoke to her about her own family's experience of arriving in Boston from another place and feeling like outsiders. And so she included these images of family members behind this kind of typical New England house who are growing out of it in a way and sort of aspiring for greater things. So we were incredibly grateful to her for her contribution there. And I'll end here with this view of the gallery showing all of the drawings by John Singer Sargent of Thomas McKeller and the way it looked when the exhibition closed in October of 2020. Thank you so much for your time.